Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday, the 13th of November. I'm Andrew Wilson, and thank you for joining me for the Full Scottish. This afternoon, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 263 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this afternoon, and then together we will look in a little more depth at the past week's headlines from Scotland and around the world. President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukrainian forces have established control in more than 60 settlements in the Kherson region, and stabilization measures are being carried out in Kherson city after it was retaken by Ukrainian forces. President Zelensky said that Russian forces had destroyed all of Kherson's critical infrastructure before they fled, including communications and water supplies, along with heat and electricity supplies. Ukrainians hailed Russia's retreat from Kherson as Kyiv said it was working to demine the strategic southern city after the 8-month occupation and to restore power across the region. In the formerly occupied village of Pravdin outside Kherson, returning locals embraced their neighbours, some unable to hold back tears. Agence France-Presse reported, "Victory, finally," one said. The head of Kherson's regional state administration said everything was being done to return normal life to the area. Yaroslav Yanushevych said from Kherson city in a video posted on social media that while demining was carried out, a curfew had been put in place and movement in and out of the city had been limited. Pro-Moscow forces are putting up a much stiffer fight elsewhere, and the battles with Ukrainian forces in the eastern Donetsk region are hellish, President Zelensky said. Ukraine would decide on the timing and contents of any negotiation framework with Russia, according to a readout of a meeting between the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba at the ASEAN summit in Cambodia in Phnom Penh. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has spoken to his Iranian counterpart Ebrahim Raisi by phone, and both leaders placed emphasis on deepening political, trade and economic cooperation, the Kremlin said in a statement on Saturday. Significant new damage to the major Nova Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine can be seen following Russia's withdrawal from nearby Kherson, according to the US satellite imagery company Maxar. And Russia said there was no agreement yet to extend a deal allowing Ukraine to export grain via the Black Sea, repeating its insistence on unhindered access to world markets for its own food and fertilizer exports, Reuters has reported. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined today by Kat Cary. Kat is a postgrad researcher in politics and psychology. She's a political analyst, parliamentary assistant, and freelance journalist based in Edinburgh. Before all of that, she served in the US Navy for more than a dozen years. Kat, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
I'm well. Still staying warm. Hope you're doing well too.
Thanks, Kat. It's great. We're very grateful to you today for joining us on the Full Scottish. Now, you heard in the introduction there the headlines from Kherson, and we'll look at the situation in Kherson and Ukraine first. For 8 months, residents of the Ukrainian city have been living under brutal Russian occupation, but on Friday, Ukrainian forces swept into the city and Russian troops retreated to the east. The residents have no water, no internet, and little power, but the mood was euphoric. Locals sang the national anthem while others shouted Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, the patriotic greeting. We feel free, we are not slaves, we are Ukrainians, resident Olga told CNN. Locals have also been climbing onto the tops of buildings, including the cinema in the square, to erect Ukrainian flags. Soldiers driving through are greeted with cheers and asked to sign autographs on flags. So, Kat, firstly, in general terms, what are your reflections on the images that we've seen from Kherson City in the past 2 or 3 days?
I think they've been so powerful, and we sometimes have conversations about um, what's in a flag and how good is flag waving. But I think that this is something we can all agree is a joyful time to see the Ukrainian flag fly again.
Thanks, Kat. Now, there were reports as the Russian forces appeared to retreat, there were reports of Chechen and other Russian forces remaining in the Kherson city, now out of uniform, and the concerns were that they would provoke Ukrainians, would kill Ukrainian forces, and would also be involved in what might be described as asymmetrical warfare in terms of setting up confrontations and setting up Ukrainian forces for apparently firing on civilians. So, is it fair to even by Sunday, where we've seen that it appears that the city has been taken completely and that the situation appears to be more stable, given in particular that there are still significant amounts of demining required, should Ukrainian people and Ukrainian forces remain cautious regarding the situation in Kherson?
Well, I do think that it's a two-part sort of way of looking at it. Yes, they have to be careful of people that might be trying to undermine the success they have of rebuilding, but also they have so much infrastructure to rebuild because, of course, when the Russian forces withdrew, aside from damaging dams, they damaged infrastructure, like you had said earlier, that there was no running water. I read that there's about 70 to 80,000 Ukrainians in the city, where it was over 300,000 before the war. So, yes, I think that they're going to be very much concentrating on rebuilding their infrastructure and having a functioning community again. And perhaps that will do enough where if people aren't participating, they always have to be vigilant. But I think that perhaps that's a conversation we're having a little bit more than the people on the ground trying to just rebuild and get things done.
Absolutely, Kat. Thank you. Now, the rebuilding process is something I was going to talk to you about next. I mean, immediate rebuilding. It struck me that one of the huge tasks at hand, immediately at hand, is the stabilization of life for the civilian population in Kherson Oblast, at least, as you say, the population who remain. Over the weekend, we've seen Channel 4 reporting on a local sub postmistress driving her van through shelling in order to deliver folks' pensions, which have to be paid in cash and in person because there's no electricity and there's no internet. Now, that pension payment is also being topped up by a payment from the International Red Cross of about £20 per person. Now, the Red Cross say we have some 700 staff working in 10 locations across Ukraine to deliver relief items to the displaced, provide medicines and other life saving activities, and to restore water supplies for millions of people. And it struck me from the images that we've seen over the weekend that there was very little evidence of the Red Cross in Kherson. Now, it may be that it's too soon, or it may be that there are other reasons at play. And I was just wondering, given the push, the success that the Ukrainian advances are having, and the freeing of such large numbers of Ukrainian citizens, should we be seeing much more mobilization of the Red Cross or other similar organizations closer to the front line in order to provide the people and resources to help the Ukrainian people?
Well, as far as international relief, I'm not an expert in that area, but um, I think that it's really great to hear that the Red Cross is putting cash in people's pockets, because we've talked about that here in Scotland and worldwide, how important that is. So maybe the top up is being done. I'm not certain, but I do think that this is really important to highlight that the work isn't done. Even if Russia completely withdraws from Ukraine, there's so much aid and so much attention that we need to keep paying to people who have been invaded and have not wished this upon themselves. I think it is just, whether or not we see the vans or the trucks with logos on it, I'm not as concerned with that as I am into hearing if things have gotten done. So hearing that there's a top up payment makes me less concerned with actually seeing a Red Cross van with the symbol, but it is important that we keep our focus on what needs to be done. Storm Arwen hit, a little over a year ago, and people were without food, or almost a year ago, people were without water for a week and a half. And it was devastating. People who were without electricity and they had sleep apnea machines and stuff like that. So it is so important because peace is not achieved until they have some sort of stability. So, to answer your question in brief, yes, we should see a lot of help from the international community, but as in, I'm not as convinced, like, whether you see the signs out or not, that they're there.
It's a very good point that you make, Kat. I was talking to somebody on Friday who is in contact with people who have fled to Kiev, uh, taking with them their own portable generator, because in order to run their dialysis machines, they need a steady electricity supply, which they cannot rely upon because the Russians are destroying so much of the electrical infrastructure across Ukraine. So yes, very much brings it home at the implications for individuals. And just very briefly as well, having spoken about Ukraine and Ukrainians, which ought to be our focus, it just crossed my mind to ask you as well, uh, where do you think, where now for Russian President Vladimir Putin?
Well, I was reading about whether or not they think what's going to happen over the winter, whether winter's going to slow down the invasion or the counter, you know, the trying to eject the invaders. Um, brief analysis is that I read is that Russia stands more to lose. It's kind of ironic that we usually hear you don't do a land war against Russia in the winter, but maybe Russia didn't take the lesson that that is also not true in reverse. Um, a lot of I've heard that the public opinions of people in Russia who I was very I think it's very interesting to read. A lot of Russians think of Kiev as like a spiritual capital or something that still belongs to them. Well, it echoes a lot of the sentiments in other parts of the UK of loving Scotland. And I don't want to draw too close a parallel because obviously there's not armed forces invading, but it is this same kind of sentimental or the sentiments that might keep the population going. But I do think that over the winter, whether or not it slows down, it doesn't spell good things for Russia. And I just have to say solidarity with all the people in Ukraine.
Of course, Kat, thank you. Symbolism and signalling are something that I think we'll touch on a few times as we look at a number of stories today. But as you say, the symbolism, firstly, of the presence of the International Red Cross Committee, but also the symbolism for Russians of the success or otherwise of their invasion. I'm thinking of cities of Odessa, like Odessa, for example, where Catherine the Great was born, and which have huge significance, and of Kiev, which is the oldest Russian cathedral in all of Russia, so in all of greater former imperial Russia. So yes, symbolism is important. So let's look at symbolism again, but this time in the connection with a different story. This week started with COP27, and Scotland once again is leading the debate as Nicola Sturgeon announced an increase in Scotland's contribution to tackling loss and damage, increasing it by a further £5 million. In her speech to the loss and damage panel last week, the First Minister said, "I am acutely aware that the funding Scotland has announced is small in terms of the overall scale of the loss and damage that developing countries are facing. But I do hope it sends an important message and an important signal. Apart from anything else, it demonstrates, as Denmark and Wallonia have also shown, that governments can act now on loss and damage if we want to. It's entirely our choice to make." And after that, Professor Salim Huck, who's the director of the International Centre for Climate Change and Development, said, "The Scottish Government's leadership in this area, including this latest funding pledge, is welcome, and I hope it will prove an inspiration to other countries to take action to provide funding for loss and damage with urgency at COP27." So, Kat, do you think is signalling and inspiring other countries? Is it important to try and shape and guide the direction of travel in this context in respect to the funding of loss and damage payments to the global south?
Oh, I absolutely think it's whether or not this will inspire other nations remains to be seen. But as somebody who lives in Scotland, it is very inspiring to see Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish government focus on what basically amounts to climate reparations, if which is cleverly rebranded into actually saying what it is, a loss and damage. Because Scotland was part of an active part of the British Empire and in colonializing a lot of these countries. So there needs to be something, and this ties back to the earlier bit about Ukraine and about war and unrest. These countries, as the climate heats up and as there's more flooding, as there's less money, there will be an increase in skirmishes, war, any kind of conflict. So paying these is really paying for all of our futures, not only for the climate, but in the stability of what those countries can take on themselves, and not trying to force them to do something, but to actually give them aid and give them the autonomy to fight climate change on their own, because it isn't fair that these wealthy global north countries keep using or just pay to offset their carbon balance, which is kind of, it can be a little bit shady depending on what you're looking at. So it's very, very important, and it's inspiring to me. Let's hope that this inspires other nations to follow suit.
That's absolutely right, Kat. The inspirational aspect is important, and on top of that, do you think is it important to be seen to be doing something and doing something now? Is that also important in terms of shaping the debate?
I think it is. I think a lot of that Nicola Sturgeon got a lot of criticism from the British press for going to COP, which is it's a little silly because, the last COP was in Glasgow, but she not only went to hand over, but she went to put forward something incredibly important and incredibly moving. Now, imagine if America did that, or, another huge nation. It would in fact inspire other nations. But I do think that countries that want to be seen and want to do good things and to tackle climate change will hopefully find this to be an inspiring path, and a method that they can show their support in a way that respects the other country's autonomy and lets them kind of figure it out on their own, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Absolutely, Kat. Thank you. Now, the First Minister commented, I very much hope that we will make collective progress on loss and damage at this COP. If that doesn't happen, I expect that more and more governments will take action on their own. My belief is that as we do, it will create a momentum for change, which will feed into future COP summits. So, taking the First Minister's words, Kat, is there, broadening it out a little bit, is there sufficient momentum on anything associated with COP at the moment?
I think that unfortunately COP has gotten overshadowed a lot, and maybe that's just because I'm sitting in Scotland and last year it was all over. But I think that there has been quite right criticism um, as to what governments are actually doing. Um, there's always a lot of emphasis on individual responsibilities or different technologies, and I think focusing on loss and damage actually forces us to look at what's happening instead of trying to distract with little gimmicks that whether or not it's greenwashing or a legitimate help, there's only so much technology can do. Now, I really think it's important to for future cops to look at global or climate refugees and stuff like that. But I do think that this is a step in the right direction in sort of a collective responsibility for the planet.
Thanks, Kat. And to finalise our discussion on this item this afternoon, as you said at the beginning, the identification of these payments as loss and damage, the successful rebranding away from reparations. Do you think, with regard to loss and damage, despite the efforts of the Scottish Government and the governments of Denmark and Wallonia, do you think there's the sufficient momentum on loss and damage yet?
I think it's too soon to tell on that. I think that you're seeing countries, Scotland and Denmark, who buy it, who are proponents of the well-being economy and not of continuous growth, are part of it. I think that it's going to take a lot more to reach a tipping point where we're having these conversations globally. We don't have long, so I'm hopeful that more countries take inspiration sooner rather than later. But we really just need to use every tool at our disposal to tackle climate change.
Thanks, Kat. Now then, let's move on in that case to, we'll bring it back to the UK because strikes in public services are being called and are happening across the UK, with the response in Westminster dictating how much, if any, additional money the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations will have to offer fair pay increases to nurses and teachers and the other public sector workers. The UK Government has been urged to increase the amount of funding available for NHS pay ahead of the autumn statement next week, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Our Health Secretary, Hamza Yusuf, and the Welsh Minister, Eluned Morgan, have both written to the UK Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, to ask for additional funding to help avert strike action this winter, specifically in the NHS. The letter includes, "We are experiencing a cost of living crisis, and the anger of NHS staff is entirely understandable. Skyrocketing inflation combined with high interest rates, a direct result of the havoc caused by the UK government's mini budget, means that we are simply unable to come close to matching the expectations of NHS staff across the country. While the support provided by the UK government on areas such as support for energy bills is welcome, it has not gone nearly far enough." So, Kat, firstly, are you detecting any hints at all from the Westminster government that they accept responsibility for the cost of living crisis, and in particular for the failure to control the cost of energy and also triggering the leap in the cost of borrowing?
I don't think there's much that the UK government is signaling other than protecting their own wealth, like all Tories do. I am I think it's a good thing that the cabinet secretaries for health wrote to the UK government. I urge them to take a look. I read an article about how the police were saying with all the upcoming strikes, they're not able to do real policing and they're doing more social work. Well, my question is, obviously our budget is very exact in Scotland. We have very limited things that we can do, but there should be more funding for social work and social care outside of what the police do because that's not their area. So, I mean, solidarity with all the striking workers. We know that there's multiple things that can create this inflation. And right now, even though there are supply chain issues and there are problems with were exacerbated by COVID, this is really about profiteering. And unfortunately, the UK government, the ministers in that government are often the people benefiting and enabling that profiteering instead of doing anything to mitigate it. So what's it going to take? I have no idea. I just think that we will see a lot of strike action before we get anything out of them.
That's a very good point, Kat. Let's look a little bit more at the letter from the Welsh and Scottish Health Secretaries. It continued, "We would therefore implore you to work with us to make the case to the Chancellor in advance of his autumn statement for increased funding for the NHS and the devolved governments as a whole, primarily to pay our hard-working NHS staff a fair pay rise in the face of the cost of living crisis this winter and avoid what could be a catastrophic industrial action in the NHS." Now, Kat, it struck me as interesting that the Welsh and Scottish Health Secretaries wrote to Steve Barclay, the English Health Secretary, not to the Chancellor. Many would say that Barclay showed his true colours regarding the NHS in England when he was a Treasury Minister. One NHS leader summed him up at the time by saying that Barclay had all the bombast and unfounded assumption of expertise of Matt Hancock, but without being a nice bloke. So do you think, are the Scottish and Welsh Health Secretaries trying to build some sort of solidarity with Steve Barclay? Why?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's their intention. It would be great to see, but I also think that they're trying to set a very specific message that they're asking for budget from the health, for NHS from the health. And perhaps because the NHS in England deals with they're going undergoing more and more privatization. Um, that's a big stark difference between the Scottish NHS and the English NHS. Now, I'm afraid I'm still a little bit too foreign, a little too much of an immigrant to understand the nuances between writing to the chancellor and the health secretary. But I do have to think that it has something to do with um, trying to make it absolutely clear to the public that this is about the NHS that we were out clapping for every Thursday during part of lockdown.
That's a very good point, Kat. We'll stick with Barclay for a moment, and then we'll come back to the wider implications. Barclay was previously a junior health minister for a few months in 2018, but he also came into contact with the NHS during his tenure at the Treasury, managing government finances. And his distrust of the NHS and the way in which the NHS exists and operates nearly led to disaster in late 2020 when it is reported he decided to block the start of the COVID vaccination programme. Apparently, Barclay argued against authorising the funding, complaining about the value for money. The NHS England chief executive at the time, Sir Simon Stevens, thankfully disregarded his objections, and the green light was given for the funding about 4 weeks later. So, do you think, if that reporting is true, do Humza Yousaf and his Welsh counterpart appreciate the kind of person that they're dealing with?
I don't think much gets past Humza Yousaf in terms of dealing with the UK government in whatever portfolio he holds. I do think that the pushbacks I hear from unionist parties at Scottish Parliament are, you're not spending the money you get appropriately. A lot of the debates that have been around, like Tory and Labour debates, have been around healthcare waiting times. So instead of like writing to specifically Steve Barclay, because the Tory government could have another reshuffle at any point in time, really. I think that this is about the actual institutions and the systems and making sure people know that they are looking to fund the NHS. Because remember, uh, I don't know if it was during the last year, probably before the council elections, the NHS staff in Scotland got a much larger pay rise than in the rest of the UK, and we protect our NHS and are proud of it. Now that is no longer proportionate to the rise of inflation. But like I said, I don't think that they're writing to the person; they're writing to the office.
Absolutely, absolutely right, Kat. And you mentioned there the institutions. So let's have a slightly wider thing for a moment. Are there indications now, and do you think there will be more indications as we get into the winter, that the cost of living crisis, and in particular the implications for funding essential public services, like Scotland's NHS, like the police, like our councils, are the implications for the funding of those essential public services, are they going to test the devolution settlements, plural, for Scotland and for Wales? Are they going to test the devolution settlements to breaking point?
I mean, I think almost anything tests our constitutional arrangement currently and devolution. I mean, after the 2014 referendum, devolution was supposed to be strengthened and upheld, and we've seen it get weakened and attacked ever since the referendum results. Um, most dramatically with Brexit and all the negotiations afterwards. I do think that we're in for a very difficult winter, and I don't think that Rishi Sunak. I mean, honestly, as painful it is for me to say, I think Boris Johnson would have done less harm to our public services than Rishi Sunak, who is wanting to bring in more austerity, which is exactly the opposite of what we need at this point in time. I can't wait for another general election. I don't think we're getting one anytime soon, but we have got to figure out a way to get these Tories out of power.
Thanks, Kat. Now we'll spend the next little while. We'll expand it a little bit and look at the autumn statement from the Chancellor that I mentioned a moment ago, because Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt have been in talks over which spending cuts and tax rises they will announce in the autumn statement on Thursday. Following the disastrous mini budget introduced by Liz Truss's administration at the end of September, the UK is preparing itself for the government to impose austerity measures of around £60 billion. Sunak has warned of tough decisions. Advance reports suggest that he will adopt a 50-50 split between spending cuts and tax rises. That's in contrast to George Osborne's ratio, which was 80% spending cuts, 20% tax rises. So what might they be and who will bear the burden? Let's spend a little bit of time and have a look at some of the options facing the Chancellor. Firstly, spending cuts. Cuts to public spending are expected to mostly take the form of what are called efficiency savings from government departments. This could mean the scaling back of some projects, Whitehall job cuts, and real terms reductions in public sector pay, and that's in the midst of high inflation. The Institute for Government has warned about this approach in light of the results of the austerity programme that was imposed by David Cameron. Even in 2010, after 10 years of generous spending increases under Blair and Brown, writes the Institute's Deputy Chief Economist Thomas Pope, there were few genuine efficiency savings to be found. Most public services have deteriorated between 2010 and the eve of the pandemic and are performing even worse now. So it is safe to assume, he says, that any efficiencies were found long ago. So, Kat, firstly, efficiency savings is just bluster, isn't it? The old Tory mantra of private sector good, public sector bad, which has been playing in the background for pretty much all of my adult life. Efficiency savings means cuts, doesn't it?
It does, in fact. And even if there wasn't a cost of living crisis right now, we have an aging population, we're recovering from COVID. It doesn't make logical sense to make cuts to the public services that we've been so dependent on, and that we are still so dependent on as we navigate through one crisis to another. Um, Cutting public services hurts the country, it hurts people living here. It's, there's only so much efficiency. Like, do they pay these people a living wage? I just had my visa renewed over the summer, and it was ridiculous how dysfunctional the process was. And a lot of times the answer when you contact the home office was to apply again. Now, I mean, this is for visas, this isn't just everyday living. But to tell people to pay another £600 per person fee is just not in the realm of reality for most of the people living in the UK today. It's I can't stress how much I'm against public service cuts and how much I think it's going to damage the nation. Maybe not on the bottom line right now, where Rishi Sunak will be held to account, but it will leave lasting legacies of damage, like Thatcher, like Cameron's austerity, like all of that.
Well, that's a very good point that you make, Kat. Kit Malthouse, the Education Secretary under Truss, said on Saturday that more cuts to schools more what are in effect cuts to schools will be a disaster. Speaking to, and I'm sorry, GB News, he said that he had seen alarming stuff in the papers over the last couple of days where they are indicating that there might be cuts to the education department. As far as I can see, he said, I can't see how that can be acceptable. So, to follow on from the point you were just making, Kat, how can you have a highly educated, high quality workforce if you're cutting education spending?
I I'm not sure that the Tory government cares about having everyone well educated in the UK. I think that's been very clear that they want the haves to keep having, and to get them into the higher education pipeline, and for everybody else to be cannon fodder, for lack of a better term, for their wealth gaining. I mean, the days of the British Empire are over, so now they're looking inward to figure out how to um, take whatever wealth and power they can from inside their own country, from the people who live here, and it's disgusting.
Thanks, Kat. We'll move on a little bit into look at one of the we'll look at a number of the aspects of the autumn statement, but let's Sunak and Hunt are reportedly considering extending the current freeze on income tax thresholds out to 27-28. Rishi Sunak originally froze the tax bands in the wake of COVID in the 2021 budget when he was Chancellor. The move was then expected to generate £8 billion. Now, with higher inflation, the Bank of England has forecast that the extension could generate £30 billion in revenue. So, Kat, Sunak likes this kind of thing. Uh, 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 or freezing the income tax bands avoids headlines and is a much more stealthy tax rise. So again, does that suggest to us that as much of what's going on at the moment is about presentation and the way in which things appear rather than what's actually going on?
I do think that Sunak is a slick operator when it comes to controlling the headlines. Like Liz Truss knew how to put together a photo shoot, like a Thatcher fan fiction photo shoot. Boris knew how to promote himself and his brand. But Sunak is very dangerous in the way he is able to present things as if they're not there. It's not the worst option out there. Meanwhile, the planet's dying, just constantly referring back to capitalism and constant economic growth is not going to do it. Freezing taxes is, I mean, the wealthy worldwide are not taxed appropriately because they can get around a lot of the tax measures. But yeah, I can't help but agree with you completely that Sunak is very dangerous in the way he operates, and we have to be quite vigilant in reading between the headlines and reading the facts of what's happening.
Thanks, Kat. Thinking of the politics for a minute, just with regard to these freezing of the tax bans, labour the shortages of workers means that wages in the private sector are rising slowly in cash terms. So a freeze in the tax bans will the effect will be to push more workers into higher tax bands, meaning a cut in their take-home pay. The Centre for Economics and Business Research said that this could result in 3 million workers paying more income tax, with 2.2 million of those being pushed into the higher rate tax band at 40%. Now, that struck me as 2.2 million delighted Tory voters that they're now paying more tax. Uh, what do you think the implications will be, or will there be no implications because these voters secretly enjoy the pain and suffering of voting Tory?
I think there's a lot of the blitz spirit that isn't maybe being talked about as overtly as it was during the Brexit crisis, but it still lives within. It's a kind of cultural baggage that I don't have, not having grown up here. Um, why do people, working class people, vote Tory? I mean, or any conservative party? It's a problem in the US, it's a problem globally. Maybe it's because if people think I'm fine, I don't want to think about anybody else, but um, protecting mine and ours, and not the others. And really, like I said before, the most wealthy in our society aren't necessarily paying their fair portion of taxes.
Thanks, Kat. Now let's look at another angle because Hunt is also said to be weighing up the reintroduction of the 50p income tax rate, a policy introduced by the last Labour government and then reduced to 45p by Osborne in his 2013 budget. Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng announced the abolition of this band in the mini budget that wasn't before they were forced to U-turn after a revolt amongst Tory MPs. Hunt is also reportedly considering reducing the £150,000 threshold at which the 45p rate of tax is paid to £140,000. At present, only the top 1.5% of earners pay the 45p rate. Now, this move that's being signalled has already prompted criticism from within his party, with the former Cabinet Minister David Jones warning that the Conservative position is that high taxes act as a disincentive to the entrepreneurship and aspiration we want to encourage. So, Kat, is this contrast and these opposing views, is this little more than more evidence that war within the Tory party is never far beneath the surface?
I think that's a great way of putting it. I think that uh, the conservatives and usually the right in any iteration is very good at presenting a united front and keeping their arguments below the surface. But I think they're very much on the verge of, I mean, we saw it with Truss coming in and going out. It's just part of why I moved to this country is because I don't think tax is a bad thing. I don't mind paying my fair share. Now, obviously, I'm not a Tory voter. So I think that there is a mix of people inside that party as well as within society who disagree on how best to move forward.
Thanks, Kat. And let's look at, there are two more elements to go here, so let's look at the penultimate one. Earlier this week, the Financial Times reported that Hunt is thinking about or planning to raise an extra £1 billion by freezing the current inheritance tax threshold for an extra 2 years until April 2028. Now, this means that that more people will expect to pay inheritance tax, which is 40% of a person's estate above a tax-free allowance of £325,000 in assets when they die. Maintaining the freeze will generate more revenue, especially as inflated house prices push up the value of people's estates. Now, this move could go down badly with many Tories. Some have dubbed the plans a slap in the face to Conservative voters and claimed they amounted to a cruel and unusual punishment being enacted upon the homeowners of Middle England. I think they actually mean Southern England. So, Kat, and I apologise to you for attempting to put you inside the mind of a Tory voter. That's not very fair, but let's try it for a moment. Do you think, is there any chance that this tax on wealth will actually happen? Tory chancellors almost never increase taxes on wealth as opposed to income.
I unfortunately I'm not sure how that's going to pan out, but I do think that this is a sign that the conservative government is scrambling to try and find any way that they can generate revenue. Um, it's a little bit of a it's interesting because conservatives are all about individual responsibility. So they haven't really been able to frame this as doing your patriotic duty, but that's what I would do if I was a Tory strategist to my voters. But Keir Starmer's Labour government is quite centrist, and I do agree with you that a lot of Tories might find that they are preferring to vote for a centrist Labour candidate or a Lib Dem, which is why, unfortunately, we probably won't see a general election coming anytime soon. So if they're going to do it, I think they're going to do it as quickly as possible and try to move on to the next thing before they call a general election.
I think that's a very fair analysis, Kat. Absolutely. Now, the final component that we'll look at this afternoon. Let's get back to windfall taxes. The Chancellor is reportedly considering raising the windfall tax on oil and gas companies from 25% to 30% and extending it backwards until 2028. This follows the first energy profits levy, which was introduced by Sunak back in May. Labour MPs have regularly challenged the government on its position regarding the windfall tax. At PMQs on the 9th of November, Sir Keir Starmer suggested that Sunak was too weak to impose a substantial tax on energy companies' profits. The tax is popular with the public, but some Conservatives worry it could discourage long-term investment. It was reportedly a source of conflict between Sunak and Johnson in the government. But there's more to windfall taxes than just an energy profits levy. The SNP's Shadow Chancellor, Alison Thulis MP, has said if the UK government actually made the right economic choices, then some of the most vulnerable in our society could be protected, and so too could public services from swinging cuts. The looming threat of austerity 2.0 is a pernicious Tory political choice, not an economic necessity. The Chancellor must abandon those dangerous plans and instead set out tax policies that will protect struggling households and businesses. Here's the point. Following in the steps of the US and taxing share buybacks, which has seen firms funneling eye-watering profits back to pockets of shareholders, and also scrapping the controversial non-dom tax status, could raise billions of pounds in revenue without hammering those already struggling to make ends meet. So, what Alison Thulis MP, the SNP Shadow Chancellor, is suggesting, Kat, does that sound like a more sensible and serious windfall tax? And it's as Joe Biden has done in the US, and that's a tax on the profits being distributed by companies back to their shareholders through share buybacks.
Um, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anybody who watches this program regularly to hear that I completely agree with Alison Thulis, and I think she nailed it. Oh, if only she was the chancellor, right? I do think that the company line for a lot of these energy companies, which is fairly similar to the Tory line, is we won't be able to invest in the future. I find that incredibly disingenuous because companies are always going to invest in their own future. So sustainable energy, if it's an energy company, is always going to be a great part because those sort of investments have the best return. They're the safest. It's cheaper than investing in oil and gas. Um, I can't I mean, these companies have been making record-breaking profits off of the cost of living crisis. We all need to pay our fair share, and energy companies, other big corporations need to pay their fair share as a a group that operates within a society because, yeah, just basically everything else Thula said is, I think, is great. I don't think that the Tories agree with that. We saw Rishi Sunak's windfall tax that came earlier, months earlier, really gave a lot of breaks to corporations so that they didn't have to pay their fair share. We need to implement this and it needs to be strong and airtight so that the people who are profiting off of this are paying back in to the people who are suffering.
Thanks, Kat. And to wrap up that section, that segment, one serious point though, is it possible for voters and others to determine what it is that a Tory government now stands for? Because it appears that they stand for higher taxes and lower economic growth.
I think that it's going to be difficult to send the message before there's another general election. I mean, there's by elections going all over, there's council by elections. I'm the way that the system is set up, I'm not really sure that there is a way to send the Tories a message because I don't think they're listening, quite frankly.
Thanks, Kat. And now, for our final item this afternoon, let's get on to your specialist subject. With most of the votes counted, the Democrats have retained control of the Senate in the US midterms, and as the threatened red wave seems to have failed to materialise, the House of Representatives, although showing a small lead for the Republicans, is still very close to call. So, firstly, the latest news in the race to control the Senate is that Democrats sealed control on late last night as Senator Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada narrowly defeated Adam Laxalt, the Republican former state attorney general, a decisive moment in an extraordinary midterm election in which Democrats defied historical patterns and pundits' projections of major losses. With Ms. Castro Mastro's victory in Nevada, Democrats have nailed down the 50 seats that they need to retain control of the upper chamber, a major feat considering that voters typically punish the president's party during the midterm elections. Ms. Cortez Masto, who became the first Latina senator 6 years ago, had to come from behind to beat Mr. Laxalt, who was backed by Donald Trump. So, Kat, first of all, what does this narrow victory for the Democrats in Nevada tell us?
It's quite it's a quite strong predictor because Nevada during the years of presidential elections, typically Nevadans would come out and vote Democrat, but it was much harder to analyze what they were doing in midterms because midterm voter turnout is usually quite low in the US. That's why they have midterms because they stagger who's up for reelection at the same time as the president when people do come and vote more often.
Thanks, Kat. That's great insight. Thank you. Now, speaking in New York, a triumphant Senator Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Majority Leader, called his party's victory a vindication for Democrats, our agenda, and for the American people. He added, the American people rejected the anti democratic extremist MAGA Republicans. Now, Jim Marchant, who helped organise a national slate of Trump aligned candidates aiming to take over state election systems, lost Nevada's race for Secretary of State to Cisco Aguilar, a Democrat. And that result means that every election denier hoping to run future elections in a major battleground state has been defeated. So is Chuck Schumer right? The American people have rejected the anti democratic extremist MAGA Republicans.
I do think he's right, and I think that this is probably the strongest one of the 2 strongest takeaways from this election is that, um, historically, as you've stated, usually a president who's less than popular, who during a recession, economic conflict, will usually lose a lot of ground, and it just shows how damaging. Now, these MAGA Republicans were oftentimes handpicked by Donald Trump. It wasn't in any kind of conservative agenda. It was to forward his own agenda with a view to running again and capturing control of the presidency and many state houses. So the takeaway here is even though the loudest voices in the conservative party have been quite populist, quite Trumpish, they are not what voters want to see. So you see a lot more sane Republicans uh, getting elected, which, you know, there's only two parties in America. I would rather see the Democrats win, but my own faction within the Democratic Party is quite a small one as it is. So I will take the win in that the election deniers, the populists. I mean, Lauren Boebert, one of the worst election deniers, COVID deniers, Trump MAGA Republicans, is facing an upset in a very, very safe seat. So you're seeing how a lot of people do want the calm that is basically Biden's agenda was calm sanity, and that still is resonating with voters, whether or not they like or approve of Biden himself.
Thanks, Kat. We were going to look at very briefly at the House for a moment because the House looks set to flip to the Republicans. But as we say, the red wave has failed to materialise. The key seats include Iowa's 3rd district and Colorado's 8th. To win control of the House, you need 218 seats. And as we came on air, the projections are that Democrats had 203, down 7, and the Republicans had 211, which is up 6. So, in broader terms, for the overall picture for the midterms, it's not all plain sailing for the Democrats, is it?
No, it's not. And so my a quick update, it's 204 for the Democrats. I'm not sure which race was called since the program started. Um,
Thanks, Kat.
but I have to say, such a razor thin majority in the House is a loss for Republicans. I can't cost of living the price of gas is usually a deciding factor. If the price of gas is perceived to be too high, usually the Conservative Party does really well. So although I personally foresee Republicans taking the House, I see it as a razor thin majority, and they're going to struggle to get any kind of agenda put forward. Although I'd like to see Democrats in control of the House, I think that the Republican infighting, similar to the Tory infighting, is going to burst from underneath the surface and kind of be more of the story. I don't think they're really going to be able to have a cohesive agenda that they get through, which is good.
Now, that's a good point there, Kat. You teed up the next question and the next topic beautifully for me. Thank you. Because I was going to talk to you about the elephant in the room, or more likely, the elephant in the locker room at his golf club. Some of Trump's most high profile endorsed candidates lost pivotal races on Tuesday, marring his status as the Republican kingmaker and leading several Republicans to blame his divisive brand for the party's disappointing performance. The outcome may increase the chances that the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, who routed his Democratic challenger on Tuesday, opts to run for the 2024 presidential nomination. While Trump has not officially launched a third White House campaign, the former president has strongly suggested he will do so and has said that he will make a special announcement at his golf club in Florida on Tuesday. So, Kat, what's your betting at the moment that Trump will announce his intention to run for president again?
This is something that's quite interesting because I think that he is oversold his hand in saying that he will run. I think there's a lot tied up in all the legal challenges, all the legal trouble that Trump is in that he may feel like he needs to run. Even though it might be not be a winnable situation. I think that if you took a good faith actor, they would probably not run. But I don't believe that Trump is a good faith actor. I think that he's going to run based on his own self interest. If I had to make a prediction right now, I think DeSantis will also run and he would probably take the nomination in a fair race. But we all know that Trump doesn't play fair. And we all know that the reasons that he is trying to run for president again are not even for, they're not for conservative values. They're not necessarily to win. They're just to save himself and elevate his brand a bit more.
Thanks, Kat. That's a very good sort of number of points that you make with regard to Donald J. Trump's motivation. But thinking about the short term, and you were saying his motivation may well be short term. How can he avoid the raft of civil and criminal claims that are beginning to attach themselves to his hulk? Uh, if even in the short term, if Donald Trump on Tuesday says that he will run, how dangerous and how destabilizing will that be for American society, whether or not Trump actually succeeds in winning the nomination?
Well, Trump never conceded the 2020 election. He's never really faded into the background. He's on conservative talk shows constantly. So announcing that he'll run at this point in time, I think will do more damage to the MAGA brand and to the Republican Party than it will do to American society. Now, if he gets the nomination, or perhaps if he doesn't get the nomination and doesn't concede that, then I think that we're going to see a lot more divisions. But I think it's more of a graduated process at this point, and he hasn't stopped creating havoc probably since the day he was born. So I don't think that at this point in time it's necessarily going to affect American society as much as if he does get the nomination. I think that will be quite hectic and quite worrying for all of us around the world.
Thanks, Kat. You finish us on an interesting thing that we must ponder in terms of nature and nurture. Was Donald Trump creating havoc before he met his father, and perhaps Ray Cohen, the notorious attorney who shaped much of Trump's approach to life? That's something that we can debate and discuss at greater length and time when we have an opportunity. However, at the moment, that is all that we have time for this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to develop the station and to make new programmes for you. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. We've set ourselves a target of adding a further 10,000 Broadcasting Scotland supporters in order that we can begin to hire staff to make more new programmes for you. For those who have donated or subscribed, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you'd like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us again then. But I hope that you enjoyed a tasty full Scottish this afternoon. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's been watching, and a very special thanks to our very special guest, Kat Cary. Thanks, Kat.
Thank you.
On this day in 1850 saw the birth in Edinburgh of Robert Louis Stevenson, the renowned essayist, poet and author of fiction and travel books. His grave on Mount Baia in Samoa carries the following quotation from his Old Mortality, published in 1884. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter, home from the hill. I hope that you have a peaceful Sunday on the sea, on the hill, or wherever you are, and I hope that you can join us again here on Broadcasting Scotland very soon. Bye-bye.